August 12, 1944. 23,000 feet above the English Channel. The air is thin and cold. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 reconnaissance pilot banks his aircraft gently, scanning the horizon through scratched plexiglass. He is hunting for bomber formations, counting numbers, noting trajectories. Then he sees something that makes no sense. Two American B-17s flying in tight formation, closer than any combat doctrine would allow. One is trailing a long black hose. The other has its fuselage port open. They are connected. Fuel is flowing between them. The German pilot blinks. He adjusts his goggles. He circles once more, camera clicking, Shin Tiao quickening. This is not reconnaissance anymore. This is witnessing the impossible. He had been briefed on American industrial capacity, on their endless production lines, their fearless crews. But this, refueling in midair, over enemy waters as if the sky itself had become their airfield, this changed everything. He turns his aircraft east, throttle wide open, film canisters rattling in his cockpit. Someone in Berlin needed to see this. The war in the air over Europe had always been a war of distance. From the moment the first American heavy bombers arrived in England in 1942, the question was never whether they could fight. It was whether they could reach the fight and return home. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were engineering marvels, bristling with machine guns, armored with hope and aluminum. But they were shackled by one brutal fact: fuel capacity. A fully loaded B-17 carried roughly 2,700 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. That fuel had to lift nearly 65,000 pounds of aircraft, bombs, ammunition, and 10 men into the sky. It had to keep 4 Wright Cyclone engines turning at 2,500 revolutions per minute. It had to fight headwinds, climb to bombing altitude, circle for formation, assembly, and somehow bring everyone home. On paper, the B-17 had a range of about 2,000 miles. In reality, under combat conditions, that number shrank fast. Every mission was a math problem written in fire and physics. Planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe pored over maps each night, calculating fuel burn rates, wind speeds, target distances. Targets deep inside Germany, Berlin, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, sat just beyond comfortable range. Crews took off knowing they would land on fumes, if they landed at all. Abort rates climbed. Bombers turned back over the North Sea, engines sputtering, gauges reading empty. Some ditched in the water, some crashed on English beaches. The lucky ones made emergency landings at forward airstrips, wheels screeching onto rain-soaked grass. Between August 1942 and December 1943, more than 15% of aborted missions were directly attributed to fuel shortages or fuel system failures. That number haunted every briefing room. The Luftwaffe understood this weakness. German fighter controllers vectored interceptors to catch bombers on their return legs when fuel was low and defensive options were few. They knew American formations were most vulnerable over the North Sea, limping home, praying their tanks held out. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Interrogations of captured American airmen revealed anxious conversations about fuel gauges, about whether they could stretch another 50 miles. The Germans did not need to shoot down every bomber. They just needed to make the Americans worry about getting home. That worry was a weapon in itself. But the Americans were already working on an answer. The idea of refueling aircraft in flight was not new. As early as 1923, the U.S. Army Air Service had experimented with crude mid-air refueling using biplanes and gravity-fed hoses. Barnstormers and stunt pilots had demonstrated the concept at air shows, thrilling crowds as one plane passed fuel to another while both flew in lazy circles. It was spectacle, not strategy. By the late 1930s, a few visionaries in the Air Corps saw potential. If bombers could refuel mid-mission, range would cease to be a limiting factor. The entire geometry of air warfare would change. But the technology was unproven, dangerous, and difficult to scale. When war came, the idea was shelved. There were more immediate problems to solve. Then the losses mounted. The mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943 saw 60 bombers shot down in a single day. Fuel shortages forced others to land in neutral Sweden or Switzerland, their crews interned for the duration. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Something had to change. In early 1944, a small engineering team at Wright Field in Ohio was given a quiet directive: make aerial refueling work under combat conditions. The project was codenamed Beetle. It was not glamorous, it did not make headlines. But it would rewrite the rules of strategic bombing. The team knew they were not inventing something new, they were perfecting something necessary. Project Beetle began with borrowed ideas and salvaged equipment. The British had been experimenting with their own refueling systems using a looped hose method developed by Flight Refueling Limited, a private company led by a determined engineer named Alan Cobham. Cobham had spent years advocating for aerial refueling as a way to extend the range of transatlantic mail planes and military bombers. His system used a weighted hose trailed from a tanker aircraft. The receiving plane would snag the hose with a grappling hook, then reel it in and connect it to its own fuel system. It was crude but functional. The Americans studied Cobham's designs, ran tests, and adapted the concept for heavy bombers. By March 1944, the first prototypes were ready. Testing took place over the flatlands of Kansas and later at RAF Alconbury in England. Engineers selected B-24 Liberators as the initial tanker aircraft. The B-24 had slightly greater fuel capacity than the B-17 and could be modified more easily to carry auxiliary tanks. A fuel transfer pump was installed in the bomb bay, capable of pushing 150 gallons per minute through reinforced rubber hoses. The hose itself was 70 feet long, fitted with a weighted drogue parachute at the end to stabilize it in flight. The receiving bomber was equipped with a retractable probe mounted on the fuselage just aft of the wing. The probe operator, usually the flight engineer, would guide the probe into the drogue while both aircraft flew at matching speed and altitude. On paper, it sounded simple. In practice, it was terrifying. The first live test nearly ended in disaster. A B-17 and a modified B-24 took off from Alconbury on a clear April morning. The plan was to rendezvous at 15,000 feet, make contact, and transfer 500 gallons. Both crews had trained for weeks in simulators and ground exercises, but the sky was not a simulator. As the bombers closed to within 50 feet of each other, turbulence from the tanker's propellers shook the B-17 violently. The pilot fought the controls, trying to hold position. The flight engineer extended the probe, hands slick with sweat despite the cold. The drogue whipped and twisted in the slipstream. On the third attempt, contact was made. Fuel began to flow. For 11 minutes, the two aircraft flew as one, joined by a lifeline of gasoline and guts. When they separated, both crews were shaking. But it had worked. Refinements came quickly. Engineers adjusted the hose length, stiffened the drogue structure, and installed guide lights on the tanker's tail to help receiver pilots hold formation at night. Crew training intensified. Pilots practiced formation flying for hours, learning to match airspeed within 2 knots, to sense the invisible column of disturbed air behind the tanker, to trust their instruments and their instincts. Flight engineers drilled probe extension procedures until they could do it blindfolded. Radio operators rehearsed the clipped communication codes used during refueling. Contact, flow, break. Every word mattered. Every second counted. By June 1944, the first operational refueling missions were authorized. The targets were deep inside occupied Europe: synthetic oil plants in Poland, aircraft factories in Czechoslovakia, rail yards in eastern Germany. These were places the 8th Air Force had never been able to hit consistently because of range limits. Now, with tankers stationed over the North Sea or southern England, bombers would top off their tanks mid-mission and press deeper into enemy territory. The tactical advantage was staggering. German air defenses were concentrated around known target areas within the bombers' assumed range. Suddenly, that assumption was obsolete. The first mission logs were cautious, almost disbelieving in tone. On June 18, 1944, 12 B-17s from the 390th Bomb Group refueled over the Wash, a shallow bay on England's east coast, then continued southeast toward Gdynia in occupied Poland. The round trip was nearly 1,800 miles, well beyond normal operational range. All 12 bombers returned. Fuel consumption data showed they had landed with reserves they would never have had otherwise. Mission planners in High Wycombe began drafting new target lists. Places that had been marked out of range were suddenly circled in red grease pencil. The map of the air war was being redrawn in real time, not with new aircraft, but with a hose, a pump, and the courage of men who flew close enough to touch wingtips at 4 miles high. The men who flew refueling missions were not volunteers in the traditional sense. No one raised their hand for this duty. They were assigned, briefed, and expected to perform. But the fear was real. Pilots who had faced flak and fighters over the Ruhr Valley admitted that refueling scared them more. In combat, you could take evasive action. You could jink, dive, break formation if necessary. But during a refueling pass, you flew straight and level, locked in formation with another massive aircraft just feet away. One gust of wind, one moment of inattention, and 2 bombers could collide, 40,000 pounds of metal and fuel igniting in an instant. There would be no parachutes, no time, just fire and falling. The flight engineers bore the heaviest psychological load. They stood in the fuselage, operating the probe controls, watching the drogue bounce and sway in the turbulence. Their hands worked levers and valves while their eyes tracked distances measured in inches. They communicated with the pilot over the intercom, calling adjustments. Forward 2 feet, hold, steady, contact. Their voices stayed calm even when their hearts hammered. One engineer, a staff sergeant from Pennsylvania named James Kovach, later described the sensation as being trapped between two moving trains. "You can hear the other plane's engines," he said. "You can see the rivets on its tail. And you know if anything goes wrong, you're the first to die." Kovach flew 17 refueling missions. He never got used to it. But the technology itself was a triumph. The fuel transfer pump, built by engineers at Lockheed and modified by Wright Field, could push aviation gasoline at 150 gallons per minute through a flexible hose exposed to -40-degree temperatures and 200-mile-per-hour airflow. The hose was reinforced with steel braiding and lined with synthetic rubber that would not crack or thaw. Our leak under pressure. The drogue parachute, originally borrowed from British designs, was redesigned with a conical shape that stabilized in turbulent air. Every component had been tested to failure, rebuilt, and tested again. By the time the system went operational, it had a reliability rate above 85%. That was extraordinary for a brand new technology deployed in combat conditions. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. In July 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Frantic, a series of shuttle bombing missions that saw B-17s take off from England, bomb targets in Germany, refuel over Poland, land in the Soviet Union, then reverse the route on the return. Without mid-air refueling, such missions would have been impossible. The bombers would have run out of fuel over the Baltic. Instead, they extended American air power 1,000 miles deeper into the Reich. German defenders, already stretched thin, now had to guard targets they had considered safe. Factories in Silesia, rail hubs in Slovakia, oil refineries in Hungary, all became vulnerable. The Luftwaffe scrambled to reposition fighter wings, but they were always one step behind. German intelligence struggled to make sense of the reports. Reconnaissance photos showed American bombers flying in formations that defied known fuel capacity limits. Interrogators pressed captured airmen for explanations. At first, the prisoners said nothing, either out of ignorance or discipline, but eventually, details leaked. A bombardier shot down over Magdeburg mentioned tanker planes. A navigator from a ditched B-24 described a fuel hose and a drogue. The pieces came together slowly. Luftwaffe analysts drafted reports for Goering's headquarters outlining what they believed was happening. The reaction was skepticism. Some German officers dismissed the reports as American propaganda, designed to intimidate. Others, more pragmatic, recognized it as a genuine technological leap. Either way, the psychological effect was undeniable. If the Americans could refuel in midair, then no target in the Reich was beyond reach. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures. Fighter groups were instructed to target tanker aircraft, which were slower and less maneuverable than combat-loaded bombers. On several occasions, German pilots managed to intercept refueling operations. On August 3, 1944, a formation of Focke-Wulf Fu-190s attacked a group of B-24 tankers over the North Sea. 2 tankers were shot down. The receiving bombers, still tethered by fuel hoses, had to break contact immediately, fuel spraying into the slipstream as hoses ripped free. It was chaos. But even in failure, the mission proved the concept's resilience. The surviving tankers completed their transfers and the bombers continued to their targets. The Germans had inflicted losses, but they had not stopped the operation. That was the critical difference. The Americans could afford losses, the Luftwaffe could not. For the German pilots who witnessed refueling operations firsthand, the experience was unsettling. Feldwebel Heinz Knoke, a seasoned Luftwaffe fighter ace, recorded an encounter in his logbook on August 9, 1944. He had intercepted a bomber formation returning from a raid on Munich. As he closed for an attack, he noticed 2 B-17s flying in abnormally tight formation. A hose connected them. Fuel vapor shimmered in the sunlight. Knoke broke off his attack, circled once, and radioed his wingman. "Do you see that?" His wingman confirmed. They watched for nearly a minute, both pilots too stunned to fire. "It was like watching magic," Knoke wrote later. "We knew the Americans had resources we could not match, but this was beyond production numbers. This was changing the rules in the middle of the game." He eventually attacked, damaging one bomber's wing, but the image stayed with him. It appeared in his dreams. It told him the war was already lost. The moral and psychological dimensions of aerial refueling extended beyond individual encounters. In German command posts, in briefing rooms lit by flickering bulbs, officers studied maps with growing dread. The Americans were not just winning the production war, they were innovating faster than Germany could respond. Every new American capability, drop tanks, long-range escorts, now refueling, represented a widening gap in technological adaptability. German engineers proposed their own refueling systems, but resources were diverted to jet fighter programs and V-weapon production. The Luftwaffe's leadership, fractured by infighting and Hitler's interference, could not coordinate a coherent response. By late 1944, German airmen openly discussed the futility of their missions. They were flying against an enemy who could reach any target, stay airborne indefinitely, and return home as if the distance meant nothing. Meanwhile, American planners pushed the boundaries further. Experimental missions tested refueling at higher altitudes in poor weather and at night. On September 5, 1944, a B-17 successfully refueled at 28,000 feet over the North Sea, well above the operational ceiling most crews considered safe. The cold at that altitude was brutal. Ice formed on the hose within minutes, but the fuel flowed, and the mission continued. Night refueling was even more dangerous. Pilots relied on dim formation lights and instruments, holding position in total darkness while the tanker's silhouette loomed like a shadow against the stars. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hamill, described it as flying blind with your eyes open. You trust your instruments, you trust your engineer, and you pray, he said, and then you do it again tomorrow. The human cost, though lower than conventional combat losses, was real. Between June and December 1944, 12 tanker aircraft were lost during refueling operations. Most were due to mechanical failure or weather, not enemy action. Hoses froze and ruptured. Pumps failed mid-transfer. One tanker, a B-24 named Lucky Strike, suffered a catastrophic fuel leak during a transfer over the channel. The crew had less than 3 minutes to react. They jettisoned the hose, shut down 2 engines, and dove for the water. 9 men survived. 1 did not. His name was Technical Sergeant Carl Munson. He was 22 years old. He died doing something most people did not know was possible. There were no medals, no headlines, just a letter sent to his mother in Oregon and a quiet notation in a maintenance log. But the strategic calculus was undeniable. For every tanker lost, dozens of bombing missions were extended. For every close call, hundreds of gallons of fuel were delivered where they were needed most. The raw numbers told the story. Between June and October 1944, aerial refueling operations enabled 347 bombing missions that would have otherwise been aborted or canceled due to range limitations. Those missions dropped over 12,000 tons of bombs on targets previously considered untouchable. Oil production in Romania dropped by 40%. Rail traffic in eastern Germany slowed to a crawl. German military logistics, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of sustained, deep-penetration bombing, and the American losses during those extended missions were actually lower than average because the bombers spent less time loitering over heavily defended areas. They could hit their targets and leave, fuel reserves intact. The Luftwaffe's attempts to counter refueling operations grew increasingly desperate. Fighter units were ordered to pursue tankers at all costs, even if it meant abandoning attacks on combat bombers. But the tankers were escorted by P-51 Mustangs, which had their own extended range thanks to drop tanks. German fighters found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Some units refused the orders outright, knowing it was suicide. Others tried and paid the price. On October 14, 1944, a gruppa of Bf-109s attacked a tanker formation over the Wash. They were met by 16 P-51s. 7 German fighters were shot down. 0 tankers were lost. The math was brutal and final. The war in the air had become a war of systems, not just courage, and the American system was proving unbeatable. August 27, 1944. The target was the synthetic oil refinery at Blechhammer, deep in Silesia, near the border of occupied Poland and Nazi Germany. It was one of the most heavily defended industrial sites in the Reich, surrounded by flak batteries and covered by Luftwaffe fighter bases within minutes flying time. The refinery produced over 25,000 tons of synthetic fuel per month, fuel the Wehrmacht desperately needed as natural oil supplies from Romania dwindled. The Allies had bombed Blechhammer twice before, but both raids had been limited in scale due to range constraints. Bombers had arrived low on fuel, dropped their payloads hastily, and turned back before defensive fighters could fully mobilize. Damage had been moderate. The refinery had been repaired within weeks. This time, the plan was different. 36 B-17s from the 100th Bomb Group took off from Thorpe Abbotts in the pre-dawn darkness. They climbed slowly, forming up over the English coast as the sun broke the horizon. At 06:20 hours, they rendezvoused with 6 B-24 tankers over the North Sea just east of the Wash. The refueling operation began at 16,000 feet. The air was cold and clear. Visibility stretched for miles. The B-17 slid into position one by one, probes extending, engineers leaning into their stations. The tankers trailed their hoses, drogues stabilizing in the slipstream. One by one, connections were made, fuel flowed. The process took 43 minutes. Not a single bomber broke formation. Not a single hose failed. When the last B-17 disconnected and banked away, the formation was ready for a mission that would take them deeper into enemy territory than they had ever flown before. They crossed the Dutch coast at 07:30, climbing to 24,000 feet. The sky was a flawless blue dome. Below, the patchwork fields of occupied Europe stretched toward the horizon. German radar stations tracked them. From the moment they entered controlled airspace, Luftwaffe command centers lit up with reports. Interceptors scrambled from bases in Holland and Western Germany. But the American formation did not turn toward the usual targets, the Ruhr, Frankfurt, or Berlin. They kept flying east. Controllers grew confused. New vectors were issued. Fighter groups repositioned, burning precious fuel as they chased the formation across the sky. By the time the Germans realized the target was Blechhammer, the bombers were already halfway across Germany. The first enemy contact came at 09:15 near Breslau. A staffel of Focke-Wulf FW-190s dove from above, guns blazing. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky. One B-17, its tail marked with the letter Q, took hits in the number 3 engine. Fire erupted along the cowling. The pilot, Captain Robert Wolfe, shut down the engine and feathered the propeller. The fire died, but the bomber fell out of formation, losing altitude. 2 other B-17s dropped back to cover it, their gunners tracking the circling German fighters. The FW-190s made another pass, but P-51 escorts arrived from the south, scattering the attackers. Wolfe managed to stabilize his aircraft at 19,000 feet. He stayed with the formation. He would make the target. At Tallinn 5 hours, the bombers reached Blechhammer. The refinery complex sprawled below them, a maze of cracking towers, storage tanks, and pipelines. Flak batteries opened up immediately. Black puffs of smoke blossomed in tight clusters, shaking the bombers as shrapnel pinged against aluminum skin. Bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites, adjusting for wind and altitude. The lead bombardier, Lieutenant James Farrell, acquired his aiming point, a cluster of distillation towers at the heart of the refinery. He tracked them through his sight, fingers steady on the release lever. At 10:08 hours, he toggled the bombs. The rest of the formation followed. Over 70 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs tumbled from the open bomb bays, falling through 4 miles of air. The explosions began 17 seconds later. Flames erupted across the refinery complex, climbing into columns of black smoke. Secondary explosions rippled outward as storage tanks ignited, fuel reserves detonating in searing blasts. The flak fire slackened as gun crews abandoned their positions, sprinting away from the inferno. The bombers turned west, engines roaring, formation reforming even as smoke obscured the target below. They had hit hard, they had hit precisely, and now they had to get home. Wolfe's damaged B-17 was still flying, but it was losing speed. The crew jettisoned everything they could, ammunition boxes, equipment, even the ball turret. Every pound mattered. The return flight was a test of endurance. The formation had been in the air for 4 hours. Fuel gauges were dropping. Wolfe's crippled B-17 was burning fuel faster than the others, its remaining 3 engines working overtime to keep the aircraft aloft. At 11:30 hours, as the formation crossed back into Germany, the decision was made. 4 B-24 tankers, which had been circling over Czechoslovakia in a holding pattern, moved into position. This was the part of the mission that had never been attempted before. Refueling on the return leg, deep inside hostile airspace, with German fighters still prowling the skies. The first tanker made contact with a B-17 at 11:47 hours. The altitude was 21,000 feet. The wind was gusting from the northwest. Both aircraft shuddered as their wakes collided, but the connection held. Fuel flowed for 9 minutes. Then the B-17 broke away, tanks replenished, and the next bomber moved into position. The process repeated. 3 more B-17s refueled successfully. But Wolfe's damaged bomber was struggling to maintain formation. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Daniel Moss, fought the controls as the aircraft yawed left, the asymmetric thrust from the dead engine pulling them off course. Wolfe called over the intercom, "We need fuel now, or we're ditching in the Baltic." The tanker pilot, Major Carl Fisher, heard the transmission. He adjusted his speed, slowing to match Wolf's crippled bomber. It was a risk. Slower speed meant more vulnerability to fighters, more time exposed, but Fisher did not hesitate. The probe operator on Wolf's aircraft, Staff Sergeant Eddie Morales, extended the probe with shaking hands. The drogue was swaying wildly, turbulence tossing it in unpredictable arcs. Morales called corrections to Wolf, voice tight. Left 2 feet. Forward. Steady. Steady. The probe missed the drogue twice. On the third attempt, it caught. Metal locked into metal. Morales opened the fuel valve. Gasoline surged into the B-17's tanks at 140 gallons per minute. Wolf held the aircraft steady, every muscle tense, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing cold. Fisher's tanker stayed locked in formation, engines straining. For 12 minutes, the 2 bombers flew as one. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, low on fuel themselves but eager for a kill, dove from the east. They had seen the tankers, recognized the vulnerability. The lead Bf-109 opened fire at 800 yards, cannon shells streaking toward Fisher's tanker. The P-51 escorts reacted instantly, breaking formation and climbing to intercept. A wild dogfight erupted around the refueling bombers. Tracer rounds laced the sky. One Bf-109 exploded in midair, hit by a burst from a P-51's guns. Another broke off, trailing smoke. But the lead German fighter pressed his attack. Shells struck Fisher's tanker in the tail section, shredding the elevator controls. The tanker lurched upward, hose snapping taut. Morales screamed into the intercom. "Break contact! Break now!" Wolf yanked the control yoke back, pulling the B-17 away just as the hose tore free, spraying fuel in a glittering arc. Fisher's tanker was mortally wounded. The pilot fought to keep it level, but the aircraft was falling. He gave the order to bail out. 8 crewmen jumped, parachutes blossoming against the blue sky. Fisher and his co-pilot stayed with the aircraft, trying to gain enough altitude for the others to clear. The tanker hit the ground near a village outside Görlitz, exploding in a fireball that could be seen for miles. Fisher and his co-pilot died on impact. The German fighter that had downed them was shot down 30 seconds later by a P-51 flown by Lieutenant James Browning. It was a hollow victory. The tanker was gone. But Wolf's B-17 was still flying. The fuel transfer, though interrupted, had given him enough to reach the Baltic coast. The formation pressed westward, now down to 32 bombers. German fighters made sporadic attacks, but the P-51 escorts held them off. By 13:30 hours, the formation crossed back over the North Sea. At 14:25, they landed at Thorpe Abbotts. Ground crews counted the returning bombers, then counted again. 32 had taken off. 32 had returned, though Wolf's bomber would never fly again. It was towed to the scrap line that evening, one engine blackened, its fuselage riddled with over 200 holes. Wolf and his crew walked away. They had survived because of a hose, a pump, and a tanker pilot who had given everything. The mission was classified as a complete success. Reconnaissance photos taken 2 days later showed Blechhammer in ruins, its production capacity reduced by an estimated 60%. But the real success was something the photos could not capture. For the first time, American bombers had refueled under fire, deep inside enemy territory, and still completed their mission. The Germans had thrown everything at them: flak, fighters, desperation, and it had not been enough. The message was clear. Distance was no longer a defense. There was no safe place left in the Reich. The loss of Major Carl Fisher and his crew cast a shadow over the triumph of the Blechhammer mission. In the days that followed, memorials were held at bases across England. Fisher's name was added to the growing list of airmen who had died pushing the boundaries of what was possible. His family in Ohio received the telegram on September 2nd. His mother kept the Western Union envelope unopened for 3 days, unable to face the words inside. When she finally read them, she wept, but she also wrote a letter to the Air Force asking only one thing: that her son's death had meant something. She was told it had. The mission he enabled had crippled one of Germany's most critical fuel sources. His sacrifice had brought the end of the war closer. It was cold comfort, but it was the truth. Operationally, the mission validated every assumption planners had made about aerial refueling. The data was analyzed immediately. Fuel transfer rates, connection success rates, time under refueling, enemy response, all of it was logged, graphed, and distributed to bomber groups across England. The success rate for mid-flight refueling during August 1944 stood at 91%. That number was extraordinary. It meant that 9 out of every 10 attempts succeeded, even under combat conditions. It meant the technology was reliable enough to build strategy around. Within 2 weeks, aerial refueling was integrated into the standard mission planning process for deep strikes. Targets that had been marked contingency only were moved to the primary list. German responses were slower and more chaotic. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that Luftwaffe High Command was divided on how to counter the new American capability. Some officers advocated for aggressive targeting of tanker formations, dedicating entire fighter wings to intercept operations. Others argued that resources were better spent defending high-value industrial targets, accepting that some bombers would reach them regardless. The debate was never resolved. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was too depleted to execute either strategy effectively. Fuel shortages grounded fighter wings. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. The newer pilots, rushed through training, lacked the skill to survive against veteran American crews and their superior aircraft. The window for meaningful countermeasures had closed. Attempts to replicate American refueling technology came too late and with too few resources. In October 1944, German engineers at Refueling, the Luftwaffe's main testing facility, proposed a refueling system for Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Prototypes were built, test flights were conducted, the system worked technically, but there was no fuel to spare for tanker operations, no industrial capacity to produce the pumps and hoses at scale, and no operational doctrine to integrate the technology into a coherent strategy. The project was abandoned by December. One engineer involved in the effort, later interviewed by Allied intelligence officers, described it as building a life raft while the ship was already underwater. The metaphor was apt. The broader impact on the air war was measurable and devastating for Germany. Between September and December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew 87 missions that utilized mid-air refueling. These missions struck oil refineries, rail hubs, and aircraft factories in regions that had been largely untouched earlier in the war. Silesia, Moravia, Upper Austria. German industrial output, already declining under the weight of sustained bombing, collapsed in key sectors. Synthetic fuel production dropped by more than half. Aircraft assembly plants operated at 30% capacity. The Wehrmacht's mobility, dependent on fuel and functioning logistics, deteriorated rapidly. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Luftwaffe sorties declined month by month. The strategic bombing campaign, long criticized for its costs and limited results, finally achieved the effects its architects had promised, and aerial refueling had been the key. The human stories from the refueling missions continued long after the war ended. Captain Robert Wolfe, the pilot who had nursed his damaged B-17 home from Bleckhammer, flew 11 more missions before the war ended in May 1945. He returned to the United States, married his high school sweetheart, and became an airline pilot. He never spoke publicly about the refueling mission until 1979, when he was invited to a reunion of the 100th Bomb Group. In a quiet moment over beers in a hotel bar, he told the story to a younger pilot who asked what the hardest mission had been. Wolfe's hands shook as he described the moment the hose tore free, the fuel spraying, the German fighters closing in. "I thought we were dead," he said, "but Fisher gave us those extra minutes. He gave us a chance." He paused, staring into his glass. "I think about him every time I fly." Staff Sergeant Eddie Morales, the probe operator on Wolfe's aircraft, returned home to Texas after the war. He worked as a mechanic, married, raised 4 children. He told them nothing about the war for decades. In the late 1980s, his youngest daughter found a box of photographs and medals in the garage. She asked him about them. Morales sat down and for the first time explained what he had done at 21,000 feet over Germany. He described the cold, the fear, the hose swinging in the wind, the German fighters. His daughter asked if he had been scared. Morales smiled faintly. "Every second," he said, "but we did it anyway. That's what mattered." He died in 1997. At his funeral, his daughter read a letter he had written to his grandchildren, never sent. In it, he described the refueling missions not as acts of heroism, but as examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the moment demanded it. The technological legacy of wartime aerial refueling extended far beyond 1945. The hose and drogue system developed during the war became the foundation for modern aerial refueling technology. By the early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force had fielded dedicated tanker aircraft, KC-97s and later KC-135s, capable of refueling entire bomber and fighter wings mid-mission. The Strategic Air Command's nuclear deterrent relied on aerial refueling to keep B-52 bombers airborne for days at a time, ensuring America could respond to a Soviet first strike even if its bases were destroyed. The technology that had been a wartime experiment became a cornerstone of Cold War strategy. Every tanker crew, every refueling boom operator, every pilot who plugged into a tanker over the Arctic or the Pacific was standing on the shoulders of those who had done it first in 1944 with nothing but prototypes and courage. German perceptions of the technology, recorded in post-war interrogations and memoirs, were marked by frustration and grudging respect. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, in his 1954 memoir, devoted several pages to the impact of American aerial refueling. He wrote that it represented a new dimension of warfare that Germany had failed to anticipate or counter. He described the psychological effect on German pilots, who increasingly felt that they were fighting an enemy with no limits, no weaknesses, no point of vulnerability. We could shoot down their bombers, Galland wrote, but we could not shoot down their capacity to innovate. That was the war we lost. Heinz Knoke, the fighter pilot who had witnessed a refueling operation over the Channel, survived the war and became an agricultural pilot. In his published logbook, he included the entry from August 1944, noting the refueling he had seen. Beside it, he had written a single sentence, "This is when I knew." The raw numbers compile. And in the post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, told the story in stark terms. Aerial refueling operations in 1944 extended the combat radius of heavy bombers by an average of 420 miles. That extension brought 73 additional major industrial targets within range. Bombing missions utilizing refueling had a 12% lower loss rate than comparable deep penetration missions without refueling, because bombers spent less time over defended airspace and had fuel reserves for evasive maneuvers. The total tonnage of bombs delivered to extended-range targets between June and December 1944 was 18,400 tons. The estimated economic damage to German war production, calculated by post-war analysts, exceeded $2 billion in 1944 dollars. And all of it had been made possible by a rubber hose, a fuel pump, and the willingness of men to fly closer to death than they had ever imagined. War has always been a contest of limits, limits of courage, of industry, of imagination. In the skies over Europe in 1944, one of those limits was distance. The earth was vast and fuel was finite. Every mission was a balance of physics and hope calculated to the last gallon, the last mile. But then something changed, not in a laboratory or a factory, but in the air itself, at 20,000 feet, where two aircraft flew as one and fuel flowed between them like a lifeline. It was not the invention of refueling that mattered. It was the willingness to make it work under conditions that defied reason. To hold formation in turbulence, to extend a probe while flak exploded nearby, to trust that the man in the other aircraft 50 feet away wanted to get home as badly as you did. The Germans saw it and knew what it meant, not because of intelligence reports or captured equipment, but because they understood the language of innovation under pressure. They had pioneered blitzkrieg, jet engines, guided missiles, but by 1944, they were fighting to hold what they had, not to imagine what came next. The Americans, by contrast, were still asking what was possible. Aerial refueling was not a wonder weapon. It did not win battles on its own, but it erased a constraint that had shaped every strategic decision since the war began. It turned the map of Europe into a target board with no safe zones. And that shift, quiet and technical as it was, changed the war. The men who made it happen were not supermen. They were pilots who white-knuckled their control yokes, engineers who cursed frozen valves, tanker crews who flew slow and straight while fighters circled. Some of them died doing it. Most came home and never spoke of it, because who would understand, who could picture what it meant to thread a fuel probe into a drogue while the world fell apart around you? But they did it, mission after air mission, because the war demanded it and because they believed it mattered. They were right. It did, not because of glory or headlines, but because it brought the war closer to its end. And in a war where every day meant more deaths, more cities burning, more futures erased, anything that shortened the calendar was worth the risk. The legacy is not just in the tankers that fly today, refueling jets over the Pacific or the Middle East. It is in the idea that limits are not fixed, that the impossible is only impossible until someone tries. In August 1944, a German pilot saw two bombers connected by a hose and could not believe what he was seeing. That disbelief was the sound of the old world breaking. The new world, where distance meant nothing and the sky had no borders, was already here. And it had been built by ordinary men doing extraordinary things, 1 gallon at a time, 4 miles above the earth,